thing we talked about was motorcycle gangs. And so now we're going to talk about music in the 1960s. Music. Now, there are so many musicians to talk about in the 1960s. I've actually taught a semester class just on the colorful and colorless 1960s. What we're talking about now, I've done a semester on. There's so much, but I'm going to mention a few. Probably the most notable musicians in the 1960s, and arguably so. One was Janis Joplin, who we already talked about. She was had a really tough upbringing in her life. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Had a very raspy, deep voice, which was unusual for female singers at the time. Kind of a swaggering attitude. And people remember her because she sang the blues, which was something that women did not do in those days. Another famous musician in the 1960s that Macklin mentioned was Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix. Played the guitar. Well, he did that, but what hand was he? Left or right? And he played a right-handed guitar, did he not? At times left-handed, which would be pretty difficult. But he was very famous. He played the guitar sometimes with his teeth. He played the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. Very, very famous rock musician of the 60s. Unfortunately, both of those individuals lost their lives of drug overdoses at a very young age, which we'll talk about later. And probably, if you talk about the 60s, the musical group everybody's heard of is the Beatles. Okay? And these two people in this group, which was 4 people, used and abused drugs. They used drug lyrics in their music. I can remember Todd Heberly and I, my buddy in high school, we got out one of the Beatles albums because we heard if you played it backwards, it would say, "We Buried Paul." Because there was a rumor out there that Paul McCartney had died of a drug overdose. And so we got down his basement, we got his turntable out, which you don't even know probably what that is, and we whipped that thing around backwards and it said, "We Buried Paul." So they used to put these lyrics different ways in their LPs or albums, and it was an interesting thing. I'll tell you a little bit about Janis Joplin. She was from Texas, and she left Texas like a lot of young hippies did, and traveled to San Francisco, California for the hippie scene at Haight-Ashbury. So she grew up in Texas. Matter of fact, off the cuff here, anybody here a Dallas Cowboy fan by any chance? Anybody know who Jimmy Johnson is? Pete, who's Jimmy Johnson? He was head coach of the Cowboys. He was classmates of Janis Joplin. Okay? Anyway, she left her home state of Texas for San Francisco, California in the hippie scene at Haight-Ashbury. There she performed different gigs at local coffee houses and bars, played in front of those types of crowds for tips, and finally joined a group known as Big Brother and the Holding Company. So she goes to Haight-Ashbury, plays a few gigs. Gigs are where you go in and play for money at bars and coffee shops. Did that for a while. Finally joined a group known as Big Brother and the Holding Company. And this group became pretty famous, and they played at Madison Square Garden in front of large crowds. They played at Woodstock. And they went out, started to tour, and started to record albums or LPs, records. Became pretty famous. So they toured Madison Square Garden, they did a concert there, they played at Woodstock, they began a tour all across the country, started recording records, and as they became more famous, who became more famouser? Janis Joplin. Media loved her, she was different. So she became very much a novelty and actually outdid her group, became more popular than the group itself. She even got a chance and got invited to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. That was a big deal in the 1960s to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. Anybody have any clue what that is? I can remember it only because my parents watched it. It came on once a week, and it was a variety show. And a lot of people like I remember, we'll talk about this, when the Beatles first played in America, it was on the Ed Sullivan Show. You ever heard of David Letterman? Anybody heard of David Letterman? His studio is where Ed Sullivan had his studio. Okay? And it was a big deal. They'd invite all this new talent in to come in and show off their wares, and a lot of these people that Ed Sullivan brought in became very famous. So if you got invited to the Ed Sullivan Show to perform, that was pretty good. At the time that Janis Joplin was asked to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, she was making six figures at the time, over $100,000. In the 1960s, it's a lot of money. So she was making six figures by the time she made her appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Well, all good things come to an end, especially in the 60s, and after recording one night, she partied until early in the morning before returning to her hotel room, and she mixed up a batch of heroin that had been delivered to her by her drug dealer the day before. So she's recording out in a recording studio, making a record or album. She parties into the early morning hours, goes back to her hotel room, and mixes up a batch of heroin that had been delivered to her the previous day by her drug dealer. And according to historians, the heroin that was sold to her was too pure. What would that mean? Now, you know, but if it's too pure, what do you think it means? Too high concentrate. So like, you know, if you drink whiskey straight or mix it half and half with water, you're going to get a bigger effect if you drink it straight than you would if you mix it. Well, this was too pure. It had not been diluted enough. And as a result of that, she died that night of a heroin overdose. She was just 27 years old. So the heroin that was sold her was too pure, and as a result, Joplin died of a heroin overdose. She was just 27 years old at the time of her tragic death. She was cremated, and her ashes were scattered off the California coast into the Pacific Ocean. I could spend 4 days telling you about the life of Janis Joplin, but again, we have time constraints. Jimi Hendrix, a little bit different story on Jimi Hendrix. He had a very difficult childhood. Music became kind of a sanctuary for him, and he taught himself to play the guitar. Never had a lesson. Taught himself. So he had a poor upbringing. He was black, obviously. Had a very difficult childhood. Music became kind of a sanctuary for him. He taught himself to play the guitar, and he dropped out of high school and worked odd jobs. Dropped out of high school and worked odd jobs. He got kind of tired of that, so what did he do? Joined the military. Joined the military. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1961. Not a bad time to enlist. It would have been mid-60s would have been a bad time to enlist because of what? Vietnam War. So he enlists in the United States Army in 1961. He serves in the Army. He was discharged in 1962 because he had suffered an injury. Went back hoping to receive a break of some kind. So he serves in the United States Army until 1962 when he's discharged due to an injury, looking for a break, and he finally gets that break when he meets a guy by the name of Chaz Chandler. He meets a guy named Chaz Chandler. Now, you don't know this, your great-grandparents might, but Chaz Chandler was a famous rock star or musician from a rock group called the Animals. Now, Grandma Sue might know who they are. You might have to ask her. She might know who they are. Okay, so Chaz Chandler meets up with Jimi Hendrix. It's the break Jimi needs. Chandler had been a former member of a successful rock group called the Animals. So Chandler became Jimi's manager, and he made him a music superstar. Chaz Chandler became Jimi Hendrix's manager and makes him into a music superstar. I mentioned this to you before. He did perform at Woodstock, and his rock rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner amazed the crowds and demonstrated his real talents as a musician. A little offbeat. You get a chance to YouTube it. I watch it. It's kind of interesting. Well, he gets a brand new band in 1969, and they're working on a new album. Unfortunately, before they finish that new album, Hendrix dies in 1970 from drug-related complications. In other words, he dies of an overdose. So he starts a new band up in 1969. They're about ready to cut their first album. They're working on it. They do not get it finished before in 1970. he dies of drug-related complications. You know how old he was? 27. Same as Janis Joplin. 27. These people are similar to John Kennedy. They become more popular in death than maybe they would have been in life. Who knows what Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix would have amounted to if they'd have lived into their 80s. Who knows how they would be remembered. Because of their popularity prior to their deaths, they are remembered as music legends. Okay, let's talk about the Beatles. Talk about the Beatles a little bit. Let's just see if we know anything. Anybody know who the original 3 Beatles were? There's 4. Anybody know any of the Beatles? Okay, go ahead. Paul McCartney, John Lennon. Okay, who was the last one to join? That's right, very good. The Beatles started in 1960 with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. Yep, the Beatles started in 1960. I think it's there on your ID sheet too. With John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. They were doing pretty good through 1961, 62. And their drummer got sick. So they tried out this new drummer in September of 1962 by the name of Ringo Starr. And they liked him so much they basically just fired the other guy. So Ringo Starr had a little tryout with the Beatles in September of 1962. They really liked him. And they signed him. And that became the group known as the Beatles as we know it today. Their first single was entitled Love Me Do. Love Me Do. What's a single? Josh? Yeah, in those days if you got a single, what'd they put it on, Macklin? 45 record. Man, if you got a record of 45, then if you sold enough copies, they'd give you this nice award. They'd make that little record gold, and they'd give you a big plaque and tell you how many millions you sold. So a single was a record, just a single that you actually put on a record player. I have one in my office, I should have bought it. And you play it. Then you get enough singles going that are pretty good, then what do you put together? An album, or they call them an LP, or a big record. It was 33 and a half that played on a turntable. Well, in 1964, this song, Love Me Do, was released in the United States, because where were the Beatles from? Great Britain, yeah. And it became a #1 hit on the American charts in 1964. Now, you guys say, I don't know if they have this anymore, but I'm telling you, when I was your age, man, you went to Mike Blakesley at Valley Auto, because he had a music part of his store, and if you went and looked at the top 25, you could pick out any 10 songs you wanted, and he would record them on a cassette tape for you, and you had a mix hit cassette. Oh yeah. He charged you about $5-6 for that, which was pretty good money in those days, but man, you could stick that in your cassette player in your car, and you could rock out to the top 10 songs you liked. We didn't download them in those types of things. We had to actually do them. Anyway, but that was a big deal, the top 20. Top 20 is a big thing. And Love Me Do became a #1 hit in 1964. Well, in February of 1964, the Beatles got booked on what? Famous variety show. The Ed Sullivan Show. My God, the Beatles were coming to America. 73 million people watched these guys on television. 73 million watched them. It was unbelievable, and I'll show you some of that later. By April of 1964, after being on the Ed Sullivan Show, they had 5 singles in the top 100 Billboard chart. 5 in the top 100. Unprecedented at that time. So by April of 1964, the band had 5 singles on what was called the Billboard Hot 100 chart. People became huge fans, and what did they refer to the Beatles as? It was all across the United States, this crazy craze called Beatlemania. Beatlemania had hit America. They finally had a concert in August of 1965. Anybody know where it was? What city? Take a guess. Big city. What would be the biggest city? New York, at Shea Stadium, S-H-E-A, Shea Stadium, home of the New York Mets. 55,000 people jammed into Shea Stadium to listen to the Beatles in concert. That was a lot of people. You can imagine what Shea Stadium looked like when they got done. Not great. So Beatlemania was on full display in New York in August of 1965 when more than 55,000 screaming fans packed Shea Stadium. Well, they became pretty popular, but John Lennon took it a little too far when he was quoted in the media as saying what? We are bigger than Jesus Christ. He said that in the media. Very good. The Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ. What did people do in protest to that comment?
They burned their albums.
Burned their albums. That a girl. Burnt their albums. So, John Lennon set up a huge wave of record-burning protests when he suggested in a public interview, quote, that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus Christ. Now, a lot of people think the Beatles went forever. Do you realize they did not go forever? They broke up pretty quick. Matter of fact, their last public appearance together was in August of 1966 when they gave a concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. So their last concert was August 1966 in Candlestick Park in San Francisco. You know how long they played? Huh? Yeah, how long was the concert? Their last one ever. 20 minutes. And what caused that rift? They started to have problems within the band. Remember how Janis Joplin became more popular than the band? Well, these guys were becoming popular in their own ways. Some like John Lennon, some like Paul McCartney, some like Ringo Starr, some like George Harrison. They started to get a little bit of rub between them. Now, the band tried to get together. They spent the first half of 1968 in India. They spent the first half of 1968 in India. And they were studying transcendental meditation, or meditation, excuse me. Help me with that, Paris. What were they studying? Transcendental meditation. They were trying to get their stuff together, in a way. You know what I mean? Because they were struggling. Well, after that stint in India, they came back and started their own record label called what, Macklin?
Apple Records.
Apple Records. Okay, they started their own record company called Apple Records. And after that, in November of 1968, they completed their first double album. Wow, double album. What does that mean, Casey, if it's a double album? There's 2 records in it. It's long, double album. Boy, that was a big deal when I was your age. Well, I tell you what, when Meatloaf comes out with a double album, you got to have it. Right? Foreigner comes out with a double album. Well, they came out with a double album. You know what it was called? The Beatles. But what's it more referred to as? The White Album. Now this is worth more than your lives, so be very careful. This is an original white album. And it simply says The Beatles. Right there. Okay, be careful with that. So the Beatles completed their first double album entitled The Beatles, or better known as the White Album. It was released in November of 1968. Disputes, disagreements, and disharmony among band members began to occur, especially during the making of this White Album. And in September of 1969, John Lennon told the band he was leaving. And they waited to announce the breakup until April of 1970. I want you to listen to that again. Disputes, disagreements, and disharmony among band members began to occur, especially during the making of this White Album. And in September of 1969, John Lennon told the band he was leaving, but they didn't break up until April of 1970. Why? Finish that one. Finish the White Album. That was the idea behind it. Now these band members went their own ways and were all very successful. Now I'm just going to tell you a story, you don't have to write this down. But tragedy hit the band when John Lennon was assassinated outside his apartment in New York City by Mark David Chapman. Came up, asked for an autograph, killed John Lennon. I will never forget this as long as I live. I get goosebumps telling the story. I'm working at the Billings Gazette when I'm in college writing little sports shorts. Part-time job. Monday night football's on. The Jets are playing somebody, and Howard Cosell is the announcer. And they interrupt the broadcast to announce that John Lennon had been shot and killed in front of his Dakota apartment building in New York City. It was like the biggest news ever. Shot and assassinated. George Harrison eventually dies of cancer. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are still alive. And because I like you kids a ton, when we get done with this material and take the test, I am going to show you a 50th anniversary concert of the Beatles in which all of your favorite artists play their songs with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr in the stands. It is about as cool as you can get, and then they perform at the end. That's kind of what we're going to end things up with this year. Okay? So there are the Beatles. Let me tell you a little bit about them in general. We'll start with John Lennon. This is what they did after the breakup. John Lennon. He released 7 albums himself between 1970 and 1980. Released 7 albums.